In this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about Volume 1 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and my focus is on chapters 1 through 3. Chapter 1 begins with Victor talking about his early childhood, and he's telling this story to Walton while he's aboard Walton's ship. And he begins by talking about his parents and who his father and mother were, and we get a little bit of background exposition about just his parents and family. He talks about his father and how devoted his father was to the education of his children. This is just at the bottom of page 64 in my text. He says, when my father became a husband and a parent, he found his time so occupied by the duties of his new situation that he relinquished many of his public employments and devoted himself to the education of his children. Of these, I was the eldest and the destined successor to all his labors and utility. No creature could have had more tender parents than mine. So just to make a point there, this idea of fatherhood and being a good parent is a theme that's going to be more emphasized as the story goes on. But it's this idea that Victor grew up with a very privileged, supported, loved childhood where he was, given every opportunity to succeed by his parents. They allowed him to read and follow his passions in life. And he was loved. He had friends, his best friends, Henry, and his adopted sister, Elizabeth, would be his main companions. We also learn that his parents had two younger children. So Victor was the oldest, and then Ernest was 6 years younger than himself. And then William is the very youngest of the family. So Victor's youngest brother. His father and mother, his mother's name is Caroline. They would also go on to adopt Elizabeth Lavenza into their family. And Elizabeth is technically Victor's cousin. But at the time, there weren't as many sort of stigma, I guess, involved because Elizabeth is understood to be or believed or wanting, Victor's mother wants him to eventually marry Elizabeth and take her as his wife eventually. So there's this promise that Victor will, he's only 14, 15 at this time, but once he grows up and, he's in his 20s, he'll want to marry Elizabeth. So they want to sort of create this or keep this bubble of their family close together, an intimate family circle. So it is a very sort of almost idyllic, idealized childhood that Victor grows up with. He has everything he needs to succeed in life, from love to education, to friends, and a sense of belonging, a father that helps guide him in the right direction. And these are all the things that we'll find the creature lacks once we hear his side of the story. Some other characters that are introduced. So I mentioned Elizabeth. Victor's other friend is Henry Clerval. So that's sort of Victor's best friend. And Victor is sort of, he says, there's a great dissimilitude in our characters. So Victor contrasts with Elizabeth and with Henry. Both Henry and Elizabeth are more interested in arts and culture and poetry. And Victor is more of a scientific mind. He says, the world was to me a secret which I desired to discover. So he's got this more scientific, probing mind that wants to investigate the world and understand all parts of it. His friends and I guess adopted sister Elizabeth, she has less opportunities in life just because she's a woman at this time in history. So her education wasn't as complete as, say, Henry's or Victor's. And her opportunities in life were restricted more to domestic roles. There's this idea that she's one day going to become Victor's wife, and that's sort of her whole role in life, is just to be a wife. So Mary Shelley, again, her mother was a very feminist thinker. But so Mary Shelley is very much aware of the restrictions in society that are placed on women. And for her part, in terms of characterizing Victor, she sort of almost sees him, at least from a modern perspective, we can interpret Victor as a kind of almost like toxic masculinity in his very ambitious mentality and how he wants to control and we'll say conquer the natural world. So Victor's characterization in chapter 1, again, it paints him as a very ambitious, very passionate, and very almost obsessive with this idea of understanding the natural world around him. So he becomes obsessed with what he calls natural philosophy, and we would probably term that biology or the natural sciences now. So it's sort of just the study of the world around you. He mentions a couple of different scientists that he was particularly sort of obsessed over. And it turns out, as his father makes him aware of, that some of these people that he studied, Agrippa or Magnus that he mentions, their type of science is now out of date. They would be considered more as mystics or almost like magicians trying to turn, chemicals into gold, or trying to discover the secret of immortality. So he talks about things like the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life. And these are, things that these old, out-of-date scientists promised that man would one day be able to control as part of science. But Victor, at this part of his childhood, he says he's sort of 15 years old, he still believes in these sort of magical pursuits of scientists, even though his father tells him that, Victor, you shouldn't waste your time reading such trashy books. These guys are, out of date, and, don't waste your time reading such nonsense. So his father tries to guide him in the right direction, but Victor is still pulled in his mind to the parts of scientific exploration that is almost based on the occult and the strange and the magical. So he wants to really, he wants to banish disease, and he wants to find the cure for all disease and find immortality, that kind of thing. Even though his father's sort of pushing him in more into the academic side of science. So chapter 2 of Shelley's novel is when sort of that bubble of their family, their ideal childhood, bursts. Victor, at the age of 17, he's ready to go to school. So everything is changing for him. And then this horrible misfortune falls on their family. His mother, who has sort of been the backbone of their family dies, and it sets off a sense of sadness that will color the rest of Victor's life. So his mother becomes sick, and he's at this point age 17. He's ready to go off to university as his parents wanted him to, but his mother dies, and her death will become something that sort of fuels the rest of his actions, because he is motivated from this point on to sort of cure death, so to speak. He wants to find a way that allows people to either live forever or cure their illness. So he has this drive and obsession with science, but he wants to do things that are beyond the natural order of life and death. So he wants to make it so people can come back from the dead, as he is traumatized by his mother's death. So with the death of Victor's mother, he goes off to university. He's now, 17 years old, a young man. And it's the first time in his life that he's ever been alone and has to sort of take care of himself. This is on page 74. He says, "I was now alone in the university whither I was going. I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic. But here he is now on his own. He meets a couple of professors that help guide him in his scientific study, Professor Waldman and Professor Crimp. And they help fuel Victor's obsession with science. So they teach him, techniques and ideas and philosophy around the study of nature. And they instill in him this sense of ambition that he can conquer nature. And he says they can penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. So there is this kind of masculinity and femininity involved in the description of science and nature and how those two things conflict. The natural world here in this quote is described in female pronouns. She works in her hiding places, nature, as a kind of mother nature. And then science is portrayed as very masculine. There's male scientists, including Victor, and he's trying to penetrate into the recesses of the natural world. So it's kind of very toxic masculinity there, trying to conquer and penetrate the natural world. Sounds rather aggressive. So there is this sort of toxic masculinity that is part of Victor's characterization, where he becomes, consumed with his ambition, and he wants to, again, take his interest in science beyond all limitations. So as a student, he doesn't really talk about friendships or social gatherings or anything like that. He becomes almost obsessive about his study. And chapter 3 opens up with a description of how he becomes, he says, "From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation." So he becomes so obsessed with his study that he basically ignores all social relationships, all family relationships. And he says, 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva. So he doesn't see his family again for 2 years while he's in school. and becomes very isolated and obsessed with his scientific study. So as a student, he's almost consumed with his studies, and it comes at a toll of his isolation, and his mental health also suffers. He becomes, again, more and more obsessed with this idea of how life is created and the source of life in the human frame. So he wants to find or discover, and he eventually does, the cause of all life. And he was also able to discover or become capable, he says, of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. So through his scientific experiments that he did, in the all hours of the night, his consuming study, he says, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. So basically, he was able to turn something lifeless and give it life. So he discovered the secret of creating life. Normally, life is created, again, in, the creation of reproduction, human reproduction, between a sperm and an egg, and that creates life. But here Victor has taken control of that process himself, done it all himself as an individual, and in a sense is wielding a godlike power. So chapter 3 describes how he becomes obsessed with science. He begins the process of creating a human being, and he does that by harvesting body parts from the graveyard. And it's very, as gruesome as you could imagine, that process of digging up dead bodies and whatnot. He describes how he made the being of a gigantic stature because it was easier to sort of form the body that way. And he sees himself as godlike in his pursuit. So he says this is page 82, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. So he even views himself as father and God to this new species of creature that he has taken it upon himself to create. And in achieving his goal, he has to ignore all of the ethical, moral, and just, repulsiveness of what he's actually doing. He talks about how he collected bones from charnel houses, like funeral houses. And he says, with profane fingers, the tremendous secrets of the human frame in a solitary chamber, or rather cell at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments by a gallery and staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. So he's basically assembling all these body parts of dead bodies, piecing it together to form a new human-looking body. And then he's also discovered the source of life, so he's able now to bestow life upon the dead, basically bringing the dead or dead body parts back to life. So all of this obsession and pursuit, it's based on or motivated by his kind of toxic masculinity, his idea that he wants to be a godlike scientist and do what no man has done before. But it also is rooted in trauma, the trauma of his mother's death, and how that broke apart his childhood innocence and his way of viewing the world.